It was another great week for running back stashes with Ray Davis, Chase Brown, Rico Dowdle, Tyrone Tracy, and Bucky Irving all showing why they appeared in these videos earlier in the season. Plus, our top quarterback, tight end, and kicker streamers all finished in the top two. But fantasy footballers are never satisfied. So let's keep looking to improve those rosters on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. This is the Streamers and Stash Show. Remember, in this show, we consider a streamer to be any player you wouldn't usually start who's a viable option this week. And our stashes are players that you may want on your bench because they're going to provide some productivity later in the season. If you haven't already, it'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. Plus, you can check out our socials, which you can see down the bottom. But let's get into it for this week. And we're starting off with the quarterbacks. And gosh, there are some good matchups this week. Been talking up Sam Darnold as a stash for weeks. And this is why. Now's the time to strike. He's got some great matchups coming up against some middling defenses. Darnold's looks very good. And this week, he gets a very attackable matchup. This is against the Lions. Aiden Hutchinson's a big loss for them and is really going to help the Vikings, who already have a very good O-line. They're worlds above the Cowboys, who obviously got dominated by the Lions last week. So I'd be expecting plenty of passing in what should be a very high-scoring game and a good day for Sam Darnold. Drake May is also a very solid option who's available in the vast majority of league, certainly before waivers went through. Now, he didn't look great against the Texans, but he did score over 20 fantasy points, and he looks significantly better than Jacoby Brissett. So at least he managed to keep the Patriots in the game for a little while. This week, he faces the easiest quarterback matchup in football. He takes on the dismal Jaguars. So there's not great upside here, but if you're streaming the position, you can certainly do a lot worse. And if you're thinking a little bit in advance, well, Caleb Williams is my favorite stash. He was the number one quarterback last week. He was my number one streamer last week. And realistically, the Bears are just starting to click, and Caleb Williams is looking pretty darn solid. Many of you are going to have him on your roster after last week, and if you're a little bit weak at quarterback, it's absolutely fine to hold him. You may also find that teams have dropped him because he's got his bye week, so you can also check that out as well. He faces the Commanders next week, and that's a very exploitable matchup. Now, you know, I personally don't love stashing quarterbacks. You can nearly always find someone usable on waivers, but Williams is looking like a very solid starter for the rest of the season. So he's certainly someone that you can pick up if you're struggling at the position. Running backs, and I think that Tony Pollard is starting to look more like an every down starter, but he definitely wasn't earlier in the season. So mentioning him in here, plus I do think that's a little bit of an illusion because Tyjae Spears has battled a number of injuries. Once he's healthy, I think this is probably going to turn back into more of a committee. But that's not going to be this week because Spears is battling a hamstring injury and is going to be out at least this week and probably a couple more as well. The Titans get the best running back matchup in football in the Bills. Pollard's a must start this week, even if the Titans themselves struggle. Tank Bigsby was very disappointing last week. Last week didn't go well in general for most of the Jaguars running backs. Travis Etienne got injured. Bigsby was barely involved in what should have been a really good matchup against the Bears because you can definitely run on Chicago. Problem is, they fell behind early. I don't think the Patriots are going to blow out the Jaguars in the same way that Chicago did. So I'm backing Bigsby to have a much bigger role this week. He's the clear early down guy with Travis Etienne out. And while Dearness Johnson will be the receiving back and the catch-up back, I guess, Johnson got all the goal line looks last week, but I don't think that's going to happen this week. I think they'll go back to Bigsby when they're in more neutral situations gameplay-wise. Antonio Gibson also struggled last week because the Patriots fell behind early against the Texans and they really couldn't establish the ground game. Gibson still got plenty of touches, but it's kind of hard to run the ball effectively when you're behind already. So I think that changes this week against the Jaguars side that realistically is just defensively really bad. I do think the Jaguars are still the favorites, which is why Bigsby is my preferred option, but I'd expect plenty of touch and scoring opportunities for Gibson still in a game where I think both sides could run the ball more than we would usually expect. That's assuming, of course, that Ramondre Stevenson is still out. Now, of course, on top of streamers, my favorite running backs to talk about are stashes. Been big on running back stashes this season, and they have paid off over and over and over again. Here's a couple of guys I want to mention this week. These are my favorite stashes. I'll go through my favorites in a second as well. Nick Chubb's just someone you've got to remember that you have on your roster or that you can potentially put onto your roster. He could very easily turn into the starter late in the season, but he's not going to be useful anytime soon. So I wouldn't be starting him this week. Against the Bengals, it's an okay matchup. But even if Jerome Ford's out, we're still going to see a lot of form and we're going to see some strong. They're going to ease Chubb in very, very slowly. They're essentially looking like they're tanking this season. They're getting terrible play out of Deshaun Watson. They've just traded away Amari Cooper. I don't even think they're trying to win. So why risk one of your best weapons when he's still coming back from a serious injury? I think he's someone you want to leave on your bench because he might be productive later in the season, but don't start him yet. Ray Davis is someone who looked excellent. He's someone who talked up a massive amount in the preseason. I was way on the Ray Davis train for the whole preseason. And realistically, I was a little bit disappointed he didn't get used a little bit more in the early weeks, just so we could see what he could do. But with James Cook going down, all of a sudden we can see that Ray Davis is very good. Nearly 100 rushing yards, plus some receiving yards as well, over 100 yards total. He gets a terrible matchup this week against Tennessee. Even if James Cook's out, I don't know that you can start Davis because you're going to start to see a lot of Ty Johnson as they need to pass the ball. But I do think Davis is someone that you want on your bench if you don't have one of the better stashes available to you. Kamani Vidal takes over from Gus Edwards as the backup to J.K. Dobbins. He will get some touches each week, but he needs a Dobbins injury before he can be useful. And even then, I feel like he's probably going to split quite a lot. Most teams aren't willing to trust rookies in pass protection. There are some exceptions. I think Davis is one of those to an extent. Braylon Allen's definitely an exception. I don't think Kamani Vidal is. So I do think that you'll probably see some other guys in there. They may bring someone in or might use Hassan Haskins if something happens to J.K. Dobbins. So Vidal's a solid pickup, but let's go through my favorite my favorite stashes. Braylon Allen's still number one by far. I'm just talking about guys, by the way, that aren't currently starting. So not talking about Bucky Irving, not talking about Tank Bigsby, just guys that are currently backups but could potentially turn into starters. So Braylon Allen's the number one option. We've seen how good the Jets can possibly be. And with Devontae Adams going there, I think their attack will be a lot better as well, more scoring opportunities. Zach Charbonnet's next. Tyler Algier can be very good if Bijan Robinson's injured. Ray Davis, I just talked about. Tyrone Tracy, Trey Sermon, talked about Vidal. Trey Benson started to get some starting touches in the last week or so. I talked about him on the waivers show. It is possible later in the season, especially if they're struggling, he starts to take over from James Conner. That might even happen sooner. Emmanuel Wilson's an okay option. Roschon Johnson, Justice Hill, I don't mind, but Kid Mitchell is coming back. That lowers his upside. And Jamal Williams, but again, Kendre Miller's coming back, so that lowers his upside as well. Let's talk about wide receivers, though. My favorite wide receiver streamers. It seems insane to say that he's a streamer, but with the way he's playing at the moment, he absolutely is. Tyreek Hill against the Colts. It's a good matchup. He's been a massive disappointment this season, but here's a couple of reasons for optimism. Firstly, Tua is going to be back at some stage. It's not going to be soon, but they have said he will be back. Secondly, their bye week should at least give him a chance to at least scheme up some things to get guys like Hill and Waddle involved. So I expect they'll be a little bit better than they will now that they know that they've got Tyler Huntley. They've had time to plan with that. I don't think they would have really thought that through, given they'd expected to have Tua and then Skylar Thompson behind him. Now they've got a totally different quarterback. Hopefully now with that break, they'll be able to use them more effectively. And lastly, and probably most relevantly, this week he'll face the Colts, who've been weak against, well, pretty much everyone. If Tyreek's going to shine, it's got to be this week. Now, Jamison Williams, again, kind of turning into a little bit of an every week starter, but he does have his dud weeks and he does have his good weeks, and this is a good week against the Vikings. They're a top 5 out wide matchup. That's according to the slot versus wide tool on the Rasball website. I definitely recommend checking that out. I will be doing my wide receiver start sit article there. That'll come out on Thursday as well. So for more wide receiver stuff, check that out. Jamison Williams against the Vikings. I mean, it's a passing offense that's just been popping off at the moment. I do think he's going to remain very good. It should be a shootout. Williams has a good chance of scoring or at least making some big plays. So strong upside start for me. And Jordan Addison on the other side of this game. They'll need to pass against the Lions, the Vikings, I think, especially if Aaron Jones is still out. Cam Akers being traded there for the second time in his career, hilariously. does suggest that possibly they do have Jones out, and I think that means we're going to see even more of the passing game. I talked about Sam Darnold earlier, and Addison should be involved because they can't just rely on Justin Jefferson the whole time. Addison back from injury, now playing back to his normal route count, so I do think he could be very good in this matchup. Very risky option as always, though. Now, the Packers have been a little bit of a mess. Basically, Romeo Dobbs is playing every down, but he's less valuable because of the role he's playing. Jaden Reed seems to only play in 11 personnel, although he did play in a little bit of 12 personnel last week. He's very efficient with the touches he gets, the routes he gets, but he's not playing enough routes to really be reliable. Christian Watson and Dontavian Wicks play the valuable role, but they share it. So basically, it's been kind of like Watson 60%, Wicks 40%, or like 70-30 earlier in the season. Watson went down, suddenly Wicks got a lot of targets. And then Wicks went down, which means Watson should have plenty of value. Before Wicks went down, Wicks was still getting the majority of touches, but that could just be Watson coming back from injury, not being quite fit yet. Potentially, they just planned on doing that first week back. Watson looked pretty good when given the opportunities. If Wicks is still down, he's someone I'm interested in. He's got a shoulder injury. I think he probably plays. But if he doesn't, Watson is a possible start. Otherwise, I stash Watson for the same reason you stash Wicks earlier in the season. It's just that Watson's the better stash of the two. He's the better player. We saw when Wicks was actually given the opportunity, he dropped a lot of catches. He wasn't very effective. I do think Watson is the better player. And Troy Franklin finally got the starting role, as did Devon Vele, actually, for the Broncos in week 6. Josh Reynolds is out. He's on IR. So certainly these guys will be around for a while. I expect Vele will fall back to the bench at some stage once Reynolds returns. But Franklin, I think, probably has the starting role ahead of Lil Jordan Humphrey now for good. It's very hard to start in fantasy yet because you need to actually see it. And he's certainly still sharing quite a few snaps, but he's been slowly progressing, slowly getting more targets, slowly getting more usage, becoming the first look in more plays as well. I do think that long-term, Franklin is going to be a good option. I was very low on Franklin going into the season because I had a strong suspicion this is going to happen. This is what it looked like in the preseason, and realistically, he's a 4th-round pick. But I do think we can kind of see the Broncos heading in that direction where they're going to start using Franklin more, and he's been dropped in most outside deeper like dynasty leagues. It's probably the only place he's even rostered. So Franklin's someone you can definitely pick up. Now, Evan Ingram, I mean, realistically, he should have jumped straight into an every down starting position after seeing him go for over 100 yards last week, but he's still not rostered in plenty of leagues. So go pick him up if he's somehow still not rostered in your league. And if he's rostered in your league, I mean, don't trade for him. Now's not the right time. But if he's rostered by you, you can probably start him and just drop whoever else you have, unless it's one of the top 8 guys. Dalton Schultz, I mean, I hate doing tight end streamers this season. This might be my worst tight end streaming season ever. My success rate in all of these positions is usually more hits but busts, but this has been the first time it hasn't been. With tight ends, I think I've got 3 strong hits and 1 kind of solid hit and 7 busts, which is not great. Luckily, picked Cole Kmet, who was the tight end 1 last season, but definitely trying to improve. It's just so hard at the moment. But like 5 out of the top 10 tight ends most weeks will be just random guys getting touchdowns. It's just too unreliable. Dalton Schultz at least has a chance of being solid. The reason being that he was badly underused beforehand, but Nico Collins has an injury, so that should mean more looks for Schultz. Plus, Brevin Jordan is injured and out for the season, so no more routes being stolen by him as well. I don't feel great about this pick, but there's not many better options out there. I certainly would play him ahead of guys like Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely. I think people are going to be burnt by them for most of the rest of the season now that they've got a lot of easier matchups coming up. Meanwhile, stashes David Njoku, someone I talked about a lot in the preseason. I think especially with Amari Cooper being out of town, he suddenly becomes massively valuable. Don't give up on him yet. If someone's going to succeed in this hideous offense, it's going to be the big guy that's going to get a lot of underneath options. I can't start him until I actually see a little bit of consistency from him, but definitely worth the stash. Definitely my favorite tight end stash. And if you're absolutely desperate, now that Cooper's out of town, you probably can realistically start him this week. Kicker streamers, Austin Seibert, top 5 kicker so far this season. And I continue my run of starting kickers against Carolina. As a bonus, Seibert's only missed 1 kick all season and has a big enough leg to get those bonus points if you get bonus points for longer kicks, and most people do in leagues these days. Jason Myers is the other guy. I keep talking about the Falcons being the best kicker matchup. Even Eddie Pinheiro with the Panthers, managed to find 9 points against them. Now, you're hoping more than 9 points here, and I think with Myers you should. The Falcons just seem to be very much allowing a heap of field goals in the way they're playing, and just realistically quite a few points as well. We've seen some boom games for them in both directions, so I do think Myers is a good option this week, I should say. And finally, DST streamers. The Broncos, absolutely my favorite, and this is not easy to see why. Sorry, not hard to see why. They're top 5 DST so far this season. They have had pretty easy matchups, but they get an even easier matchup this week. Spencer Rattler's a turnover machine. Chris Olave's injured. Rashid Shaheed's probably injured as well. I can definitely see the Saints scoring at most like 10 points maybe. Should be plenty of sacks available. The Broncos are good in whatever league settings you have. They're definitely my number 1 DST this season. And I remain the second most accurate DST ranker on Fantasy Pros at the moment. I'm going to drop back a little bit overall. I think I'm down to 14th out of 200 and something odd. So not my best week, but certainly DST-wise, we're still up there. Colts DST, it's hard to really trust them because they struggle to get sacks, but they do really keep point scoring low. So if you're in a league where you get a lot of points for sacks and interceptions and things like that, then the Colts aren't really the greatest. But if most of your points for DSTs come through low point scoring and low yardage totals, then I do like the Colts. The Dolphins have really struggled to move the ball. I did talk about them potentially being better this week, but I still think the Colts are a viable option if none of the more popular pickups are available, because at least they have that upside of being in a very low scoring game. Of course, they have plenty of downside here because the Dolphins could really turn things around this week as well. And that's all we've got for the streamers and stashes for this week. I will be back on, I think, probably Friday, Saturday. Oh, there's more. Friday or Saturday, and I will be talking all my starts and sits for the week. But for now, I hope you will like and subscribe on YouTube. Plus, follow us on Instagram at The Fantasy First Down. I release all my rankings there first. On Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and our website where I put my rankings up, and they'll be up very soon, they're probably up now, in fact, is ffdfantasyfootball.com. Plus, you can check out my articles over at football.rasball.com. I look forward to seeing you guys in a couple of days for the Start Sit show. I'll see you then.